during this past year, we've had two major studies done that publish data on deforestation emissions globally from tropical forests. One in January by a group from the Woods Hole Research Center, and the other in June by a group led by scientists at Winrock that included scientists from many other institutions as well. The concern was that they had very different numbers that they came out with that seemed to indicate that there was a substantial disagreement about how large the amount of emissions, of carbon emissions from tropical deforestation was. And we were quite concerned because of the implications of this for policymakers. In what seems to be the case is that science is going to inform policymaking one way or another. Either it's going to create confusion or it's going to add clarity. In this space around the climate change negotiations, the experience is that when there's confusion about the science, it's an excuse for doing nothing. So it seemed important to address that, and we were really quite pleased that the two groups of scientists were interested in working together to better understand what was involved in the methodologies and the definitions in their analyses. So the first part of this is actually seeing if they were willing to sit down together. These are two groups, both with very credible leading scientists. They're very busy people. And it was important enough to them to decide they were going to dedicate a substantial amount of time to resolving their differences. So we worked together, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, where I work, which is a group of philanthropic foundations, together with Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, encouraged this group of scientists to work together, provided them with some funding to be able to allocate their time to it. And we started off by basically asking them to start exchanging information, and then brought them together for a couple of days to meet together to begin to really talk about what their methodologies were, what the scope of their analyses were, and to start to explore why they had such substantial differences in their result. Well, a large part of it turns out to be definitional. It's a question about what is it that you're actually reporting estimates for. In the case of the Winrock group, it was what they're reporting on are emissions from gross deforestation based on satellite detection of forest conversion and on an underlying map of forest carbon stocks. In the case of the Woods Hole group, what they were reporting on were emissions from land use more broadly that included a number of activities that fall more in the box of degradation than in the box of deforestation. It wasn't clear initially that that was the case, but it turned out that was a substantial amount of the difference in the scope of the work and led to different results. So the intent when we started wasn't actually to sort of try to get to the same number, but rather for everyone to understand their differences in a way that was sufficiently clear to be able to communicate with both the scientific community and the policymaking community. And so what they did was really dig into each other's work, question each other quite a lot. They now have as much knowledge about one another's methods and approaches that usually scientists only have for their own lab group. So that's, I think, is good progress. And what they were able to do, first of all, was to essentially decompose the analysis so that the Woods Hole analysis, which was more complex, was able to pull out the number that was in fact most comparable to the gross deforestation emission number. They were able to look then at the same time frame that they were focused on as well, and to essentially run each other's numbers and look at what they came out of it with. In the process of doing that, remarkably, with these very different methodologies, they ended up with roughly the same number in terms of what the gross deforestation emissions are. And we're able to put that in the context of other emissions from land use as well. That should help policymakers, because one of the things that's really important in this process is to really know what your benchmark is that we're measuring things against. Now, most of the negotiations here focus on what's happening at the national level. Negotiators represent their countries. They're reporting on what happens at the national level. But there's an underlying purpose here to reduce emissions at the global level in order to avoid catastrophic climate change globally. And so being able to benchmark global emissions from deforestation is important for that. And over the past several years, a number of groups, the European Union, for example, have set rather vague targets about cutting deforestation emissions in half. Well, it remains a kind of somewhat of a theoretical target until you know in half of what. And so now we have a benchmark that has been confirmed by two different kinds of approaches and can serve as a means against which to both make those targets and measure progress. So that benchmark for the gross deforestation from emissions is 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. So that's the gross deforestation part, the first D in red. If you then add in other emissions from land use, degradation, peat emissions, emissions from soil, from land use change, then it adds about another 2.3. Now that 2.3 is a lot less certain. There's a lot more uncertainty associated with degradation in particular that still needs to be resolved. But when you add those in, it becomes a total of 5.3. Well, there's not much incentive to do it normally. And if you're a scientist, you do research. My previous career was as a university scientist. So your motivation is to do your own research, to publish your own results, to show that you are in the lead of your field. And science doesn't typically put a premium on collaboration and working towards consensus, because we're in a space which is so important for policy making, particularly now that we're clearly failing globally to deliver on climate change mitigation that's needed. To really understand where we are with deforestation, which is one place where there is progress being made, it is possible to actually reduce these emissions very substantially in the near term, is quite important. And so for that reason, it's sort of accelerating this process by which science progresses, gets to better results, gets to more accurate results over time is a priority. I think it's really important, so particularly in the land use arena around emissions, it's probably the space where there's the most uncertainty in emissions globally. And we have now a rather disaggregated groups of scientists working on things. There are some efforts to overcome that, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to really work in encouraging scientists to very quickly resolve their differences, not necessarily striving to get the same result, but striving to really understand why results are different at a level that is meaningful, that can be worked on, and that's transparent for the rest of the scientific community and for policymakers to be able to understand.